The last year, I mean, I forget how many years that I've been doing this. I always prepare something, really think it through. It turns out I never talk about it. So I figured this time I wouldn't pretend. It's always more interesting just to go into the discussion after an interruption. So let's just start with the interruption. So anything, yeah.
Yes, sir. In your book, you talk about your plumber came by and you were sitting in the dark because you had no lights. And I found it uncanny because we're going through this now here in Massachusetts with the electric utility deregulation, and it's right on the money. What's happening is they're not doing anything, and it's all for profit. And the slightest little thing puts a whole neighborhood out. And one of the things we're trying to do is educate people, and it was amazing to me that you and your plumber knew this. I mean, it was just amazing.
Not surprising that the plumber knew it. I don't know if you know what he's talking about, but it was a case where the plumber came to fix something and the lights were out, and we were talking, and he was saying that he'd gotten himself his own generator because he, just looking at the way the systems were deteriorating, he figured this is going to happen more and more over time. So. On the other hand, if you look closely, I'll bet you it won't happen so much where I live in Lexington, because that's an upper middle class town. And the way things are moving, and in fact that's the nature of so-called deregulation, is towards transferring costs to poor people. And in fact it's even taught openly in the business schools now. I mean, there's a thing you probably know that's called the 80-20 rule, which is try to get rid of 80% of your the people you deal with, because you don't make any money out of them, and concentrate on the 20% who you really make money from. So by now, with good, quick data processing, apparently if you claim, I can't prove it, maybe you know, that if you call the phone company post-deregulation, in the old days, during the Bell monopoly, part of the arrangement which granted Bell a monopoly also imposed public interest conditions. So they had to provide service to everybody and reasonably equal, independent of costs. So in fact, the old AT&T would in fact subsidize local service for everybody by artificially raising long-distance service, which is mostly for rich people and businesses. With deregulation, of course, that's over, and it now goes the other way around. So local rates go up for poor people, and then there's all sorts of scams to ensure that it goes up even higher. On the other hand, business rates go down, and rich people and businesses can make use of all sorts of devices to get around the rates such as they are. That's also expected. That's exact prediction that was expected for Asia and the rest of the non-industrial world, even semi-industrialized countries like Asia, when the telecommunications agreement was made at the World Trade Organization a couple of years ago, that this would raise rates for most people in Asia. On the other hand, it would lower long-distance rates for a select few. The 80-20 rule just generalizes to everything. So it is now alleged, I can't swear to it, that when you call the phone company, if you want to complain about slamming, or their account was wrong, or you want to have a question or whatever, they can determine within seconds after you call in whether you're a high user, one of the 20%, or a low user, one of the 80%. If you're a high user, heavy user, then you get a person, and you can talk and ask information and so on and so forth. If you're a low user, you better have a book to read. You'll start, some music plays in the background, and thank you for calling Ma Bell, and we are here to serve you. Don't hang up. That's the way airlines are going to go. In fact, anything that is trying to maximize profit, you expect to go that way. And so that's why my guess would be that in my neighborhood there probably won't be many power outages, but in Dorchester there are plenty.
You're right on the line.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the nature of what's called deregulation. It's just, it doesn't, it's a funny notion. It usually leads to concentration and oligopoly, but also transfer of costs towards the rich and, for the rich and against the poor. That's the point of it.
Yep, Professor Chomsky, I'm Tim Harcourt from the Australian Council of Trade Unions. You speak a lot in your book about markets and equity, and we've had a big discussion amongst ourselves about economists. Who would you believe would be, in your professional life, an economist that you would most agree with, and who would be the one you'd least agree with?
It's really hard to say. On technical questions, like what will the effect be of if the interest rate is lowered by 0.3%, what's the likely effect on the value of the ringgit or something? I think there are plenty of economists who can give you good answers. On the other hand, if you're asking the question about, let's say, how does the economy work, the last person you'd want to ask is, for example, Alan Greenspan, because he hasn't a clue. And you can see this when he gives talks. So, for example, just a couple of months ago, he gave a talk to the Association of American Newspaper Editors or something like that. I just mention him because he's, the most powerful man in the world, or certainly economist in the world or something. He talked about the miracles of the U.S. economy and how the great achievements of rugged individualism and entrepreneurial freedom and get the government off your back and all this great stuff. And then he gave a series of examples to demonstrate it. I wish I remembered exactly, but the examples were things like the internet, jet planes, lasers, computers, transistors, a set of things like that. And what was interesting about his list, that every one of them is a textbook example of production and development in the state sector, without exception. He didn't miss one. The only one that came even close to not being a joke was transistors. The others, it was just a joke, and they were all developed in the state sector for years and years and then handed over to private profit. Transistors, you could at least claim that they were developed in a private laboratory, namely Bell Labs. But of course, that's a joke too, because that was Bell Labs in the days when AT&T was a monopoly. So therefore, using monopoly pricing, AT&T could tax the public with high rates to run a very good research lab, Bell Labs. And as soon as deregulation came along, that research lab went down the tube, because it's no longer being publicly subsidized. So that's just another device for taxing the public to carry out research and development. That aside, transistors which were developed in Bell Labs were based on wartime technology, which was all government supported and developed. So they took over wartime technology, adapted it, and made transistors. And that's only a piece of the story too, because there were no users for transistors. In fact, the market for transistors, for especially high quality transistors, for about 10 years was the government market. In fact, Western Electric, which is I don't know if it still maybe doesn't exist anymore, but it used to be the Bell supplier. This is from memory, I may not have it exact, but in 1958, as late as 1958, I think it's around 10 years after transistors were developed, I think that all of the Western Electric's high-quality transistors were going to the government. If the government is providing the technology, permitting monopoly pricing to tax the public, providing the market through procurement and so on, then you could finally end up with transistors. And the transistors are mostly being used for things like computers, which come straight out of the state sector. My own university, actually my wife was programming back in the 1950s for the SAGE system, which was a completely fraudulent operation that was going on in a lab called Lincoln Laboratories, still there, run by MIT, 100% governmental, high-level clearance, tell me what he was working on and stuff. But it was working on an air defense system we now know, because of documents that have been released, that by 1955 everybody knew that it's no use. I mean, no matter how good an air defense system you could develop, it wasn't going to do anything because things were moving to intercontinental missiles and so on and so forth. But they kept working on the SAGE system. And in fact, what the SAGE system was actually doing was, in fact, what most of the university and national labs were doing. They were developing the basis for computers. And as soon as they got to be viable, so not rooms full of vacuum tubes, but things that you could actually sell, the managers of the SAGE system pulled out and formed the first mainframe producers. That's where DEC came from. IBM was making its substantial profits were coming from using the Harvard Mark series, which is government, the MIT Whirlwind, which is government, SAGE, later on National Security Administration, which is the basis for the stretch computer in the early 60s, and so it goes. All right, let's get back to asking Alan Greenspan about how the economy works. To him, all of this is an example of rugged individualism and getting the government off your back. But and in fact, the examples that he picked are striking, unless it was intended as a joke, striking in their ignorance of the most elementary facts about the economy. Now, I don't think that that's just Alan Greenspan. I mean, there are people who study these topics, but almost every study, mostly in technical literature, like, coming off of people interested in technology studies or something, everyone who studies them starts the study by doing a literature review, and they always say the same thing: they can't find any literature. I mean, it's just not a topic that economists study. And in fact, this goes way back. There's, the origins of the Industrial Revolution in the United States were around here, eastern Massachusetts, textiles like everywhere. And then it spills out over to other things. When you take a look at the literature, you'll notice that when economists talk about the origins of the textile industry, they always cite one paper by a guy named, I think, Mark Bill or something, who, in some journal of economic history, who investigated the textile industry in eastern Massachusetts back in the 1820s and concluded, rightly or wrongly, that, I forget the number, but like half of it would have been wiped out if they hadn't put up very high protective tariffs to keep out cheaper British textiles, some number like that. And that's the one paper everybody cites. Well, why do they always cite the one paper? The reason there isn't anything else. People don't study the way that the economy actually developed. They don't, I mean, there are studies, you can find technical studies. I'm interested, so I've looked. You can discover technical studies on things like, in the 19th century, the United States developed what was called the American System of Manufacturing, which, just astonished the British. It was something totally new, with interchangeable parts and standardization of equipment. Also, interchangeable people and standardization of people. That was the other side of it. So people were supposed to be turned efficiently into things like pieces that you could interchange. I mean, that's where Taylorism comes from and so on. And this whole system was extremely productive, and it was mostly developed in the armories. The Springfield Armory and places like that. Yeah, there you could develop all of these things. I mean, even the railroads, the big achievement of the 19th century. It was much too big a management job for private capital, so they turned to the army, which did have experience and understanding and for large-scale management projects, and the Army Ordnance laid out the basic structure at the managerial level of how the railroad system was going to operate. In fact, it's hard to find a case where this isn't true. Nevertheless, what the line that you get is free market economy, marvels and so on. And furthermore, it's not just the United States; it's every other industrial country too. I think, without exception. Certainly true of England. It's true of Germany, true of Japan, true of the East Asian countries. It's just like standard. On the other hand, market prescriptions are imposed on some people, like poor people or third world countries. That's traditional. In fact, probably a large reason why they are poor. They are subjected to market discipline, but not the sectors with privilege and power. I mean, you can see this in today's newspapers. Simply take a look at what's going on, I don't know, say Brazil. how many rich investors are going to lose money if Brazil goes down the tube? Well, answer, none, because that's the role of the IMF, to ensure that the investors get paid off for their high-risk investments at the cost of the taxpayer or the poor Brazilians. And in fact, that's the way the system works. But you're not going to find that out from Alan Greenspan. On the other hand, there are some things which you can find out from Alan Greenspan, to give him credit. When he testified before the Senate Banking Committee a year or two ago, I forget when, and he was talking about the fairy tale economy and all the marvels and how proud he is to preside over it and so on. He also described what it was based on. He didn't talk about maybe because he doesn't know that that all the dynamic sectors are coming out of the state sector. Like that. What he did talk about, and he does know, is that it was based on greater worker insecurity. He said that was a very important factor about the modern economy and why it's so great. If you have, and the reasons you understand, that greater worker insecurity means that people are frightened and intimidated and afraid to ask for a raise, or join a union or anything like that. In fact, he cited some figures showing that the number of people, the percentage of workers who were asking for higher wages has declined some large amount as a result of making what they call changes of labor market institutions that make the workforce more flexible. It's all supposed to be really good. Meaning people don't know if they're going to have a job tomorrow. They are scared. About 70% of workers, according to the Labor Department polls, are afraid that if they try to join a union, they'll probably be canned. When you have that situation with greater worker insecurity, that's very good for the economy. It lowers the risk of inflation, keeps profits up. Any economist can explain to you that's very good for the health of the economy. Not good for the health of the people, but health of the economy and health of the people are uncorrelated notions. So that he had straight. He's undoubtedly right about that. A greater worker insecurity and intimidation of the population is really good for the economy. In fact, the contemporary, you want to find out something about the fairy tale economy, are people reading the latest EPI report, Economic Policy Institute report? Michelle Bernstein, State of Working America.
No.
Okay, well, there's a very important book that comes out every 2 years. I happened to get my copy in yesterday's mail. It just appeared. The latest edition just appeared. It's put out by the Economic Policy Institute called State of Working America. It's kind of the main standard database for what's going on to working people, most everybody in the economy. And this one goes. The latest data is up through 1997, so it just came out last month. And it tells you, it's the same story they've been telling every 2 years, except updated. And it tells you just what the fairy tale economy is. This is the first, it's nothing that everybody doesn't know, it just has all the data. The economy has been, since the early 70s, mid-70s roughly, the economy has slowed down. There's been a period of much lower growth than the post-war period. Productivity has slowed and so on. Virtually all the wealth that's been created, which is less than before, has gone to the very top part of the the income distribution. For working people, for the typical family, people are now working about typical family is now working about, in the United States, 15 weeks a year more than they did 20 years ago at stagnating or declining real incomes. The United States now has the heaviest workload in the industrial world. It's also the only country in the industrial world that doesn't have legally mandated vacations. At that, incomes are at best stagnating for the majority of the population. Now that's a fairy tale economy. And the reason it's a fairy tale economy is because for the top few percent, it's a fairy tale. They've just, they're going through the roof. They point out, the editors point out in the introduction that the only gains in the past, essentially 20 years, have been to CEOs and in stock inflation, asset inflation on the stock market. Well, you take a look at assets on the stock market, they also give figures for that. It turns out roughly half are owned by the top 1%, and of that, most, by a large percentage, by the top 0.5%. So 1% owns roughly half the stock. The top 10% own most of the rest. About 85% of the total increase in stocks in this great stock boom have gone to the top 10% of the population, mostly to the top 0.5%. In fact, the second decile, 90th to 80th percent in the income level, have actually lost net worth during the Clinton recovery, meaning net worth means assets minus debt. The second 10% have actually lost during the recovery. Below that, mostly worse. The ones who've been hit hardest are the youngest. I mean, like entry-level wages are way, 30% lower or something like that than they were 20 years ago, which tells you what's going to happen up the road. It's now even true of white-collar workers, even scientists and engineers. I mean, unless they're in a very high bracket, their wages and incomes are declining. So that's a fairy tale economy. This is the first. This Clinton recovery, which you hear one kind of wonders about, is the first one, certainly in post-war history, maybe in American history, in which most of the population has been left out. It wasn't until the end of 1997 that median income, half below, half above, median income reached the level of 1989, which was the peak of the last business cycle. That's unheard of. I mean, at every other business cycle, it's been way higher this many years after the peak of the last business cycle. But for some sectors, it's fantastic. And Alan Greenspan had his finger on it. Part of the reason is just intimidating working people. The part of it, which he doesn't talk about, is the vast government expenditures and development. The most dramatic recent case is the Internet, mostly developed in the state sector for almost 30 years, just handed over, commercialized only a few years ago, 1995. And then there are other things like, liberalization of financial capital undoubtedly had a huge impact. In lowering growth rates, lowering productivity, and increasing inequality. That's essentially, and also wiping out welfare state measures. That's not a big secret. Those are all. But by the measures that economists use, this is all contributing to the health of the economy, and not the economists who write for the Economic Policy Institute. To answer your question about
the ones closest to your views. EQed.
Well, I think they're good economists who talk about serious things and tell the truth. They're not talking about what happens in some abstract model of a free market economy which follows neoclassical rules and has nothing to do with the real world. They're talking about what happens in this messy world we live in. And they have many interesting things to say.
We'll keep quoting them. We'll keep quoting them. We'll use all this stuff.
I would look at it. I think that, I think their stuff is very solid. In fact, I'm not the only, across the board, their work is regarded as quite serious. So people may not like their politics aren't particularly left. I think their politics would be what you would call, say, mild social democratic in most of the world, I would guess, something like that. But they're dealing with real world problems, and giving data about them. I think the data won't surprise you, because I think you sort of know it from your lives and your neighborhoods and so on. But it's not what you're reading in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and so on. Actually, the Wall Street Journal, you do read it sometimes, but not in the popular press.
I'll be handing out the EQed chart book. I don't know if you've seen it.
It's a very good book. I think it's on paperback. It's not that expensive, and the latest one just came out. Like I say, I just got it yesterday.
If you were rewriting manufacturing consent today, are there things that you would change in your appraisal of the media? And also, since you brought it up, what do you think about the Internet? And has it lived up to the potential to get around filters that information goes through in the news media?
Well, if it's mainly Ed Herman's book, that's why his name's first, but if the two of us were rewriting it today, we would change some things. For one thing, I think when we talked about those 5 filters, we realized at the time, but we left it in, that the 5th one, anti-communism, is too narrow. I mean, it's really a subcase of something more general. I mean, for the system to work properly, people have to be frightened, and they have to shelter under the wings of authority. Fear of the Soviet Union was a good way to frighten them. But by the time we wrote that book, late 80s, it wasn't working anymore. I mean, it was clear to the Reagan administration that the use of the Soviet Union as a device to intimidate and terrorize people is not going to work very long, because it's going to collapse. And in fact, if you look through the Reagan years, there was a constant, and we should have put this in, there was a constant search for some new devil to frighten people. So, I don't know if you remember, back in 1982, the White House was surrounded by tanks because Libyan hitmen were wandering around Washington and going to assassinate our leader and so on. In fact, there were constant conflicts conjured up with Libya, which is a nice, convenient, cheap punching bag. They're not going to shoot back, and everybody hates them, and so on, all through the Reagan years to try to just intimidate people. Arab terrorism was a tremendous fear. Every couple of years, they'd stir up an Arab terrorist crisis, and the whole tourist industry would collapse in Europe because Americans would be too frightened to go to France, let's say, because there might be an Arab terrorist hiding behind a lamppost who was going to shoot them because they're an American. I mean, in Europe, it was a joke. I mean, because everybody knows that any European city is about 100 times as safe to walk in as any American city, and no Arab terrorists lurking around. But it was a good way of frightening the American population. The drug scares are another one. I mean, those are mostly concocted, concocted as a technique of social control. And for one thing, to get rid of black people, because you got nothing to do with them, so throw them in jail. And other minorities, and for another thing, to terrify everybody else. So these, in fact, the whole crime story is a media political class and media concoction. Crime is a pain. It's not nice, but crime in the United States is not off the spectrum. It's very much like other industrial societies. And usually not at the peak. So I think it's lower than Australia and things like car theft and stuff. Pardon?
Your crime rate's lower than Australia?
In some categories. I think car theft or something.
You're more likely to have your car stolen
but in fact, see, there's a lot of illusion, even in murder. Even if you check murder over the last 20 or 30 years, the United States is toward the high end of the industrial societies, but not off the top. The only category in which the United States is off the spectrum is killings with guns. But that has to do with the gun laws and the gun culture. It doesn't have anything to do with crime, But you take that away, and the United States is kind of toward the high end, but not off it. In fact, very much like the rest of the English-speaking world, and not unlike other countries. On the other hand, fear of crime is far greater here. And that's, this has been inspired by propaganda, and it goes way back. I mean, you're from Australia, so I'll tell you a story about Australia, but I was teaching in Oxford 30 years ago in England, in 1969, I guess it was. And there was an Australian guy teaching there, and we were talking. He said he had an invitation to go to teach in Indiana, but he didn't know whether to take it or not. And I asked him, what's the problem? He says, well, I don't want to bring is it really fair to bring my family into this place that's all infested with criminals and drugs and so on and so forth? And I assured him, Indiana's pretty safe. And then he said, but in order to get there, we're going to have to go through New York. Now how can I subject my family to going through New York, where gangsters hanging off of every rafter, and black criminals and this, that, and the other thing. Yeah, that's a kind of an image. But it's an image which has been concocted. It tends to be believed outside the country. And in this country, it's very much believed. This is one of the very few countries, in fact, I don't know another one, maybe you can tell me, but It's the one country where for years crime has been a political issue.
South Africa.
Maybe South Africa. Yeah, okay. South Africa, Russia, probably China, Iraq. I mean, I'm sure there are other countries, but in the industrial world, say, Germany or France or Denmark or someplace, there's crime, but it's not considered. But politicians don't compete to see who's going to be tougher on crime. That's not the way you win an election, by being tougher on crime. That's pretty much a U.S. phenomenon. And the fear of crime has been concocted. And to get back to your question, I mean, I think when we talked about the fifth filter, we should have brought in all this stuff. The way artificial fears are created with a dual purpose. For one thing, to make it convenient to attack people you don't like. I mean, whether they're, priests organizing base communities in Central America or ethnic minorities you don't have any use for because they're not adding to profits anymore, so you throw them in jail. So partly to get rid of people you don't like, but partly to frighten the rest. Because if people are frightened, they will accept authority. I mean, during the war, for example, Second World War, people voluntarily, and in my view rightly, accepted discipline and authority. You follow orders because there's bigger fears out there. So, yeah, huddle onto the protection of the authority figures and you do what they tell you. But in order to maintain that when there's no actual threat, requires concocting threats. And the anti-communist filter was one of those, but we treated it much too narrowly. So that ought to be changed. The other big change, and I think both of us agree on this, is that in the book, as case studies, we picked only foreign policy examples. And that creates the illusion that somehow it's different when the media deal with domestic issues, and it isn't different, it's the same. So what we should have done is mixed it. And in fact, since then, both of us have been dealing mostly with the media, when we deal with the media and domestic issues. And that was an imbalance, and a very misleading. Because then, you get the sense, and you can understand how you would get the sense, well, okay, the media kind of conform to state power on international issues. But when you have domestic problems, they don't do it, which is totally false. It's dramatically the same on domestic issues. I mean, trade issues, crime, pickets, always the same. But those are the main changes that I think I would want to see made. And I think Ed Herman would probably agree on this.
Okay, and a follow-up question on the internet.
Oh, the internet. Well, the internet has an interesting history, like most technology, but in this case dramatically so. It was developed in the state system. So it grew out of DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, the research agency of the Pentagon, back in the 60s. And that's where the basic ideas were worked out and the basic technology and so on. And they had a primitive net, primitive by today's standards, dramatic by those days' standards, called the ARPANET. The universities were brought into this. In fact, during the 1980s, I have a daughter who was living in Nicaragua, and the mail was blocked and everything was blocked and so on, but we could communicate over the Pentagon ARPANET because she had access to it somehow, and I'm at MIT, so I have access to it. So that way we could communicate thanks to the Pentagon while the Pentagon was trying to wipe out Nicaragua. But in the late round, I forget the exact. I mean, there was some private input, what's called private input, like BB&N's company in Cambridge, both Brannick and Newman, since been bought up by some big conglomerate. But they were a major private developer for the internet, however, on federal contracts. So it's like the way IBM developed computers on federal contracts for the National Security Administration. So yes, that's the kind of private input there was. There was also some coming out of Xerox PARC and things like that. The World Wide Web, which was major innovation, that came out of another government laboratory, namely CERN in Geneva, the high energy physics international laboratory. That's where the basic ideas of the web were developed. That was around 1990. It's pretty recent. About somewhere in the 80s, I forget when, the backbone of the system was handed over to the National Science Foundation, so still under government control, but the military sort of was running its own system. This continued into the 90s. It wasn't until 1995 that the system was commercialized, handed over to Bill Gates and the like. Well, to mention Gates, as of 1994, so 1 year before that, Gates himself said he didn't see any future in the internet. In fact, he was so uninterested he wouldn't even go to meetings about it. And that was the general attitude in the business world. Didn't see any point in this stuff. But quickly it began to be understood that can be a major source of profit. In fact, it's now expected to be, the booming growth area for the economy, and there's all kind of hysteria about it. Internet stocks are going through the roof. They'll go down again. Almost everybody thinks that it's all inflated, but it's a reflection of the hysteria about the profits. Now, the Bill Gates types, in fact, the industry generally, they tell you exactly what they want to do with it. During the period when it was under the control of the Pentagon, it was completely free and open. Of course, limited in access. Like not many people had access. You had to be in a pretty privileged sector to get access. But if you had access, it was free and open. You could do anything you want. And a lot of very good stuff has gone on the internet. And that they want to stop. There's a lot of subversive activity, like the Organization Against the Multilateral Agreement on Investments, which was extremely important. That was mostly through the internet. And it was effective. I mean, I assume you know this story. If not, I'll back up and talk about it. But has that been?
No, I don't think they know.
Yeah, okay, well, all right, let me come back to the story, but it's an extremely important story. It's kind of like a super NAFTA, which the rich countries, the OECD countries, were trying to ram through in secret. The world's super investor rights agreement gave corporations everything. Actually gave them the rights of states, not just the rights of persons. So naturally, you had to keep it secret because everybody knew everybody was going to hate it. So it was carried out. The negotiations were carried out in secret for about 3 years. Secret is a funny word for it. I mean, the corporate world knew all about it, and they were publishing public documents about it and so on to their own constituency. The media knew all about it. I mean, you had to be an idiot not to know about it, but they kept it quiet. That's secrecy. When it came out it just broke through early, except for Canada, which was about a year ahead of everyone else. The news broke through just early this year in Australia in January. Remember? Yeah, last January it broke out. It broke through in the Australian Financial Review, and then there was a big furor, and there was a meeting in Melbourne last February where the guy who used to be head of the High Court, Mason, yeah, right. He made a speech in which he denounced the veil of secrecy in which all this was, and it was more or less the same in every other country. The United States a couple of months later, but the story sort of came out early this year. There was a huge furor about it. The OECD couldn't pass it because of the pressure, public pressure. How did it get out? Well, it leaked through the internet. A draft of the treaty was leaked. People in Canada and France and Canada, activists managed to get it up on the internet. There was a lot of organizing done through the internet. There were other things too, like meetings and the usual stuff. But the internet communication was a very important part of it, and the news got around, and very quickly a big popular reaction developed, to the strong enough so that the OECD had to back down. They were expecting to pass it last April. They couldn't do it. They tried to do it in secret last October. Couldn't do that either because it was just too much public furor. And the business world was in a panic about it. I have an article about this. It just came out. There's a book of mine just came out called Profit Over People, which includes an article I wrote last summer for Z Magazine on the reaction in the business world when this broke down. The major business newspaper in the world, a good newspaper, you can learn a lot from it, the London Financial Times, had an article with the title something like Hordes of Vigilantes. It was about how these poor little people in meeting in Paris or wherever it was, the heads of the rich countries, the heads of all the multinational corporations, the banks, the financial institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, poor little intimidated people were overwhelmed by a horde of vigilantes who sort of crushed them. They didn't know how to respond to this attack, and they had to back down and couldn't deal with this terrible phenomenon. And then they quoted the trade experts talking about how awful this was. They said that, in fact, they said it may be the case that from now on we will not be able to make trade deals in secret and have them rubber stamped by parliaments, like in the good old days, because now the news is just getting out. That's happening in a lot of things. In Indonesia, for example, the popular organizing in Indonesia against the regime has been extensively through the internet. It's a mode of communication outside of the control of the major institutions. And to go back to contemporary plans, the goal now is to kill that, to try to destroy that aspect of the internet and to turn it into a home shopping service, a modality of control. So when you get on the internet, so vast, especially the web, you're going to have to go through a portal, and that'll be run by Microsoft or 5 other guys. And they'll design, the idea is to try to design it so it'll lead you in a special path, First, like when you turn on a television set, first thing you do is watch, 20 minutes of advertising, or you pick up the telephone to call somebody, and you get advertising and so on. So first it'll take you to preferred sites, and the idea is you hope that most people will be sort of absorbed in that, and then maybe extremely dedicated people who sort of know what they're looking for and are willing to fight through and have enough resources. Maybe they'll get to the point where they can contact other people interested in the MAI, but you'll filter away most everyone. And bring them into the preferred world in which people are passive consumers. Their whole life is nothing but satisfying artificial wants, as they're called in the advertising industry. You have to create artificial wants, make people want things they don't want, make that be the whole value of their lives. So the idea that you might say have some control over your work or, over anything that happens in your life, that doesn't even arise. I mean, you as a human being, so that's the goal of the advertising industry, to create a new kind of person. In fact, that's what they call it. They say to nullify the customs of the ages and turn people into passive, isolated consumers who see no value in their lives. Their lives are worthless, and they can't do anything. But they can accumulate commodities that they don't want. That they can do. And you have to focus on that. And life, starting from childhood, people have to be turned into that. And they also have to be kept from one another. So the idea that people might, say, help each other or care about each other, you're not supposed to have that. I mean, take, say, education. There's a big attack, as you know, on the public education system. And the reason is because the public education system is based on an extremely dangerous idea, namely that you should care whether your neighbor's child gets an education. And you got to knock that out of people's heads, because that's too much concern for somebody else. You have to be concerned whether your kid gets a good education, and you have to be given a government voucher to make sure your kid gets it, and if the other kid doesn't get it, too bad. Same with Social Security, same with social programs generally, same, of course, with unions. They're the worst of all. I mean, injury to one is an injury to all. My God, we can't let that live. So this is an enormous attack on any idea of solidarity, of sympathy, of interaction, of the idea that you could have some kind of life outside of that, having more shoes in your closet. And that's what the internet is supposed to be. So selling commodities, but also selling ideas and attitudes, because that goes together. In fact, an awful lot of advertising is just selling the idea that you're a passive consumer. It doesn't even matter whether you buy that particular brand or not. Just sell the idea that there's nothing to life but being a passive consumer. This is very conscious, I should say. This is, you read advertising industry literature, you just talk about it openly. Yeah, of course. So turn the internet into that and prevent it from being used for subversive purposes, like people communicating with one another outside the framework of the institutions of indoctrination, like the media and Harvard University and so on and so forth. Because people, if they find their way around these things, it can be dangerous. And whether that'll work or not, nobody knows. It's a terrain of struggle right now, very live one. But that's the future of the internet. It'll be determined by how people react to this.
In
In the book, you talk about ways to expand democracy to the masses. One of the things we learn in class is employee ownership. Do you see that as a viable method to advancing democracy or giving people more voice?
Depends how it's done. I mean, if it's a matter of giving every employee tiny piece of stock which is handed over to some money manager which is run by Merrill Lynch, no. Then it's nothing. It's just it's not even redistributed. You cut down wages and you give a little bit of it to some stock. If it has to do with actual control of what's happening in the plant, then it's something else. So I don't think you can say whether it is or not. Depends how it's done. I mean, it's certainly intended to be a technique of control. It's intended by the planners to be just another technique of control. Everybody will be a capitalist. You and Bill Gates will both be capitalists, both equal. So maybe you'll get $5 a year, and he'll get $5 billion a year, but it's basically the same. And if you're getting your $5 a year, then you won't ask unpleasant questions about, I don't like the way work is organized here, or I don't think we ought to be producing this. I think we ought to be doing something else, or something like that. If that's what employee ownership is, then it's not a good thing. On the other hand, it doesn't have to be that. There's potential power there. But that's always been true. It's been understood for centuries by people concerned with maintaining authority that, quote one of my favorite figures, David Hume, you look at his foundations of government, he says, power is in the hands of the governed. And the rulers have to understand that and do something about it. Because if the governed, meaning everybody, if they ever realize that they have power, there's no way in which authoritarian structures are going to be preserved, whether it's military states or those days the feudal system or corporate capitalism, which he wasn't thinking about, of course, or anything else. That's a maxim that goes back very far in history, and it remains an important one. And I think it's true of employee ownership, too. Power is in the hands of the government. They can run things if they want. And you have to drive those ideas out of their heads. So a large part of what education and the media and so on are about, to eliminate those subversive fruits. That starts in childhood. And that's why you don't see sitcoms about people organizing to take over their factories.
I was intrigued by a number of things in the book. In particular, as you're saying now, it sounds like, my goodness, there's a terrible conspiracy and it's having its effect on people. And I think if we look around ourselves, we have to say they seem to be winning. Also, near the end of the book, it talked about people come to you looking for the magical cure. The magical key, I think, is what you refer to it as. To me, what I'm curious about is your assessment of the population and where we're headed, because it seems to me to say this message has been out there, people have been aware of it, but nobody seems to be stepping up. It leaves me with a very terrible set of assumptions to make about the mass of people. Are they that stupid? Are they that easily intimidated? Or are they that fearful? And then the follow-up question, because Liz got one of those too, was, and delivering the message in the form that it comes. Another part that the book talked about was a lot of people, when they leave the interactions, they feel somewhat depressed. Delivering this message in this form, is it helping?
That's right, I agree.
Or are you part of the conspiracy here?
Well, for one thing, there isn't any, there isn't even any conspiracy on the part of the advertising industry. It's not a conspiracy.
Okay.
Like there's a meeting going on in Davos, or wherever the heck it is. They're skiing or something like that and probably talking to each other, but they're not planning anything. And if they are, it's ridiculous. These are just the way the institutions naturally work. I mean, there's no conspiracy at General Motors to raise prices and make working conditions as rotten as possible and so on. The point is, if you're a CEO and you don't do that, you're not CEO anymore, because that's the nature of the job. And same if you're a professor at Harvard. I mean, it doesn't work 100%, but you get too far out of line, you never would have made it there. You have to be sufficient. You have to internalize the values. You just don't move along in the system. So there's really no conspiracies. On the other hand, your point is, that with that qualification, I think what you say is right. I mean, if I give a talk somewhere and leave the audience feeling hopeless and depressed, that's my fault, because that certainly shouldn't. I mean, it may be a consequence of the way I tend to talk about things, but if so, it's my fault. It's a fault of mine. I would overcome it. And there's no reason to feel that. I mean, there's certainly, compared with, if you look over a stretch of time, things are, I think, undoubtedly improving. So maybe things don't look very good now, but say, take a look at the 1920s. In the 1920s, the labor movement was totally crushed. There's, in the United States, there's one of the best, maybe the best American labor historian, David Montgomery, retired recently. He's a former steel worker or something, who then went into the academic world when he was kicked out of the Union on some McCarthyite thing. He's a really good historian, taught at Yale, but he has a book called, I think it's called The Rise and the Fall of the House of Labor, or some title like that. And the fall of the House of Labor that he's talking about is the 1920s. At that point, there was a very vigorous, lively, active working class movement, starting in the mid-19th century, fighting, developing. By the 1920s, they were dead, and a lot of them were literally dead. The United States has a very violent labor history, unlike other industrial countries, and lots of working people are just murdered. The major union labor leader, Eugene Debs, he was tossed into jail. Woodrow Wilson, when he came to the regular amnesty, Christmas amnesty, he amnestied everybody, but not Debs. He wasn't going to let him out. And he was like a social democratic labor leader. The unions had been crushed. I mean, workers from abroad, I remember, like workers from Australia came. I couldn't believe the way American workers were treated. I mean, in fact, a right-wing press in England, London Times and so on, was running articles about how they can't imagine how working people can be treated like this. Well, that was the 1920s. And it was, that's the period of mass manufacturing, the automobile era and everything. 10 years later, it was quite different. And in fact, real achievements came out of the working class organizing of the 30s. They're still with us. There's attempts to destroy them, like the current attempt to destroy Social Security, which has been moving remarkably well in the last few years. 10 years ago, you couldn't have imagined. I mean, even the Reaganites couldn't talk about it. Now there's like bipartisan consensus that you have to essentially destroy Social Security. The only question is how. So that's a big achievement, but that's a propaganda achievement. And an achievement in which the media played a big role, incidentally, and are playing a big role, and economists. Not all, of course. But that's an achievement of the 30s, and there are many others like them. And there were more in the 60s. Like free speech came to the United States in the 60s. And people say First Amendment, but that's nonsense. I mean, it got its real meat, began to mean something really in the 60s. And in fact, as a consequence of the Civil Rights Movement, to a large extent, and the labor movement. I mean, they sort of forced it to become an issue, and finally the courts came along and said, yeah, free speech. And many other things. Now they're being cut away all the time, of course. Like right now, there's a struggle to defend the by international standards, the very limited healthcare system in the United States. The United States is, again, alone, I think, unique in the industrial world in not having a national healthcare system. But there's something, it was established in the 60s. And again, not like a gift, it was a result of popular activism, and now there's an effort to destroy it. So the efforts to beat this wave back are constantly going on. On the other hand, the wave keeps continuing. And over a stretch of time, it gets a lot better. I mean, as bad as things may now be for the labor movement, you can't hire Pinkertons to murder workers in the street. And into the late 1930s, that's exactly what was happening. So yeah, things are better. So that you shouldn't, if I'm giving the feeling that there's no hope, that's my fault. Because certainly over time, there's this progress and there's no limits to hope. In fact, the effort to show that there's no hope, that's part of the propaganda. In England, in the Thatcher years, there was something, she was called Tina Thatcher. TINA stands for there is no alternative. Right? So give up, you guys. There is no alternative. I mean, if you can get that into people's heads, then you really win. And of course, that's not true. I mean, now they talk about, globalization is like some force of nature, kind of like a hurricane. You just sit there and watch it go by. Yeah, that's TINA. And it's a total nonsense. There's no reason why any of it is out of popular control.
In Ohio, we will often talk about the conspiracy theory with public education and prisons, because they're building more prisons, and they have usually our unions fighting against each other for the budget, because a lot of the money now is going to prisons instead of public education. And then they've taken the name, the Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections, and changed it to the Department of Corrections. They really don't believe in rehabilitation, and they're not shy about it. And then they're also believe that these inmates have to do something in the community to make good for their crimes. So they have inmate labor, taking away some of the public services jobs, and have slave labor, or just free labor, or sometimes they pay them with very little, like $1 a day or $2 or $5 a day. Can you comment more about that conspiracy?
Actually, it's not a conspiracy. It's a plan. And a sensible plan, but conspiracy is a word that's used to try to make things sound ridiculous or from outer space or something. But yeah, it's a perfectly sensible plan. And in fact has deep roots in U.S. history. So, for example, in the early part of this century, there was an industrial revolution that took place in the southeast of the United States, in Georgia and Tennessee and Alabama, with mines and steel plants and that kind of stuff. It was mostly developed on the basis of slave labor, except you couldn't have them, they weren't slaves anymore because of the Civil War. They were prisoners. So they were blacks were thrown into prison, and then they were used as contract laborers in the mills and in the mines and so on. And it was very frank. It's not that anybody kept it secret. So the owner said, look, we don't want to have the kind of problems they're having in western Pennsylvania, where these people are, taking over towns and striking in plants and so on. We want what Alan Greenspan wants today, an intimidated labor force. And the optimal intimidated labor force is prisoners. Can't do better than that. I mean, they're not going to form a union. And if they cause any problems, you toss them in solitary or something like that, torture them or something. Furthermore, it's exactly what economists love. It's a flexible labor force. If you don't need them today, they go on the public dole, right? You stick them back in their cell and the public pays for them. If you do need them today, you take them today. If one of them makes too much noise, you throw him out and you get somebody else who makes less noise. Perfect labor force. It also drives down wages outside for the obvious reason. And incidentally, it's not just public service jobs, like, say, Boeing, for example. There's a big fuss, rightly, about Boeing shipping out machinists' work to China for slave laborers. But they're also shipping it out to prisons not far from Seattle. Yeah, that's the same thing. Okay, and that's contract, that's prison work. It's growing, it's growing pretty naturally, but it's just one aspect of the huge growth of the prison population. So I mentioned before that U.S. crime rates are kind of within the range of other industrial countries. And if you go back to 1980, incarceration rates were also within the range of industrial countries. High end, but within the spectrum. In the 1980s, the prison population roughly tripled. It passed South Africa per capita, past Russia. In the 1990s, it's been going up even faster, still going up. And in fact, it's now 5 to 10 times as high as any other industrial country, although the crime rate isn't higher, sort of like other industrial countries. Furthermore, and this is planned. In fact, when the drug war, a lot of it's a consequence of the drug war, which is a complete fraud. It has nothing to do with drugs. And in fact, almost every criminologist agrees on this. This is true of its international aspect, like attacking peasants in Bolivia and Colombia. And it's true of its domestic aspect. It is agreed almost across the board, that the way to prevent drug use is educational methods. They're maybe way more efficient and effective and far cheaper, but they don't have the right coercive character. It was understood when the latest phase of the drug war was called in the late 80s. It was clearly understood that Moynihan, Daniel Patrick Moynihan is one of the few senators, I don't like him much, but he's one of the few senators who actually looks at social statistics. You know, he was a former social scientist. So he could see what every criminologist and sociologist could see. If you look at trend lines in the 80s, the use of drugs was declining. Marijuana use, for example, peaked around 1979 or 80, around then. But criminalization was very low. And there's good reason for that. The people who were using marijuana were children of rich people. And you don't throw them in jail. You know. So criminalization was low, but use was high. Through the 80s, drug use declined. And it didn't have anything to do with drugs. Use of all substances declined. So coffee, tobacco, red meat, you know. In this era, among the more educated sectors of the population, all this stuff was declining. On the other hand, among poor people, it was staying pretty level. You know. Poor race and class are reasonably closely correlated in the United States. So that meant, especially black and Latino populations, it was staying steady, whereas and poor whites too, but more educated, you know, upper middle, you know, you go up the ladder, income ladder was going down. Well, at that point, you know, a point where these lines are crossing, you call a drug war. And Moynihan pointed out, he said, you know, we are determining, by calling this drug war, we are determining to have a crime wave among minorities. Okay. Which is exactly right. They were deciding to have a crime wave among minorities. And the sentencing system was adjusted to make sure that that would work. So sentencing went way up for things like possession, you know, or victimless crimes, basically. For victimless crimes that somehow involved drugs, sentences went way up. And incidentally, sentences for things like murder went down. So in fact, Human Rights Watch did a study of New York State recently, and they claiming that these are all human rights violations, which indeed they are, that the sentence for having, you know, a few ounces of cocaine, just having, not doing anything with it, was roughly like the sentence for murder and arson with intent to kill, you know. If you look at the people who are being tossed into jail under 3 strikes, many of them it's for things like possession and victimless crimes, essentially, and very precisely targeted. Well, I'm sure you've all seen this, but the crack sentences are about 100 times as high as powder sentences for cocaine. Well, that's a class issue. I mean, crack's the drug of choice in the ghetto. You know, cocaine, powder is the drug of choice where I live, Lexington, for executives coming home in the evening. Furthermore, police practices work like that. Now, that's not really a conspiracy. That's just natural. I mean, if some of you are in, you know, if you know, and if some are in the policemen's union, you know very well that if you're a policeman and you want to arrest somebody in an upper middle class suburb, say in Lexington, that's not going to be so easy. They're going to have, you know, 1 million lawyers and, you know, courts and drag you through the dirt and this, that, and the other thing. On the other hand, if you go to a broken down community in Roxbury and you pick a kid off the street, nobody's going to do a thing. Well, you know, those factors are known to everybody, certainly everyone working in the police system, in the so-called justice system. So that has an automatic effect, you know, of concentrating the crime among essentially devastated communities, defenseless people. And the justice system then works the same way all the way through. When you get to the courts, it's the same. You may have seen, when the Pope was here, there was like a fuss about death sentences. And one of the cases, which had a story in the Globe, was about a guy who's, I don't know, 23 or something like that, who committed murdered somebody or something when he was 16. And it turns out he's psychotic, you know. But he's on death row. So the United States is going to kill a 16-year-old psychotic kid, basically. The United States is the only country that does this. In fact, I mean, like, I'm sure they do it in Iraq, or maybe the Taliban do it in Afghanistan and so on. But of countries that we would like to think about, the United States is the only country that does this. In fact, the United States has not signed the convention. There's an international convention for protection of the rights of the child. The U.S. hasn't signed it. There's only one other country that hasn't signed it, Somalia, and they haven't signed it because they don't have a government. But of countries with a government, the United States is the only one that hasn't signed it, and one of the reasons is because it prohibits execution of juveniles. There are others, but that's one of the reasons. Okay, now this kid, they went through his story. I mean, how come he wasn't? He didn't get a psychiatric defense? Well, he had a public defender. They didn't have the money for it. Well, that's not the case if you're rich. You get plenty of lawyers, plenty of protection. In fact, and it's a scandal the way white-collar crime is not treated. When a big pharmaceutical company concedes, as they have, that they have put drugs on the market which kill people, and dozens of people without warnings, and they knew it, they get a slap on the wrist, $100,000 fine or something. They don't get sent to death row. And that goes across the board. Same with, if you look at deaths in the workplace. I mean, those are, I forget the exact numbers, but they're very, 40,000, yeah, that's, like roughly on the order of alcohol-related deaths or driving deaths, but they're not prosecuted. In fact, you have repeat offenders. Like, speaking of three strikes law, same corporation will do it over and over. I mean, they know nobody's going to go after them. So yes, the whole justice system is very sharply skewed to try to create a crime wave, exactly as Moynihan pointed out, but focused on the right people. And one of the aspects of that is prison labor. But another aspect is just getting rid of people who aren't useful for profit making. And a third aspect, and I think we shouldn't overlook it, is frightening everybody else. Making people feel that they're in real danger. Crime is a danger. It's mostly a danger to poor people. Overwhelmingly, it's a danger to poor people. But that's not the people who are voting for heavier crime, heavier sentences and so on. That's everybody else who feels frightened. And that fulfills a general purpose, a purpose of intimidating the population so they'll follow orders. So it has all of these aspects. But this is social policy. This is very carefully designed social policy. In the criminology literature, the mainstream criminology literature, it's discussed quite openly. People talk about the crime control industry in the United States, the prison industrial complex. There's a new book coming out by some criminologist called The New American Apartheid. It's well understood in the profession. It's planned, and it's functional. It's functional, kind of like forcing poor mothers with children into the workforce, often at public expense. Yeah, it drives down wages for everybody else, aside from what it does to them. And the same is true of prison labor. It drives down wages. It intimidates working people. And just having the people in jail. Actually, putting the people in jail is, I don't know if this is true in Ohio, but in California at least, the fastest growing white-collar profession in the 80s was security forces. And prison guards are a big political group. I don't know if they're unionized or not, but they are a big political force which wants more prisons and fewer schools for obvious reasons. Plus, and the same is true of by now, the system is large enough so that it's beginning to be like other public systems that private industry can make money off of. Like Campbell's Soup, you wouldn't imagine this, but one of the biggest maybe the biggest single purchaser of Campbell's Soup is the prison system. Okay. And it's the same is true of high-tech industry. Like, Lockheed and these guys who are used to feeding off the public purse through the Pentagon are now moving into high-tech human control systems. So if you read the corrections journals, they call it corrections, like you said, The United States has given up on rehabilitation officially. You're absolutely right about that, and it's been condemned for it. Because elsewhere in the industrial world, and in fact by human rights conventions, prison is supposed to be for rehabilitation. And theoretically it was that in the United States. Now, like you said, they've given it up. No more rehabilitation. But high-tech industry is getting interested because they can do things. In fact, my own guess, speculation, is that the prison population is going to level off. And the reason is that there's now technology being developed which enables you to imprison people in an apartment. So you can have them under surveillance with supercomputers and things around their legs which will send shocks if they walk in the wrong direction, and you can monitor phone calls and do your analysis by long distance. You can really have people under tight control by high-tech measures, which means a lot of profit to high-tech industry at public expense, and without the need for sticking them in jail. But these are big, in many rural areas of the United States, like rural New York. Having a prison in the region is a big plum. Communities fight for it. Employment is bad. This is a lot of jobs, a lot of money for the construction industry, for the real estate industry, and so on.
When you say that so many minorities and poor people are imprisoned as a result of a plan, is the plan, in your view, to imprison poor people and minorities, or is the plan to obtain votes from a population that is primarily non-poor and non-minority who goes to the polls, and those who will not go to the polls are the minority poors anyway, so might as well incarcerate them, and those are pretty cheap votes?
I think it's both. It's very hard to dissociate because they're in parallel. I mean, the effect of creating I'm going to take Moynihan again. The effect of creating a crime wave among minorities is both of those things. It gets rid of black males who you don't have anything to do with in the industrial system because it's collapsing, and it frightens everybody else if you can turn it into a political issue. Okay, that's why since the 60s, in fact, there has been a major attempt to frighten everybody else about the danger of crime. The United States is, again, quite different from other industrial countries in this respect, in that creating fear of crime has been a conscious and major activity on the part of political leaders and the media and so on. And it's undoubtedly works. But the things go together. I don't think you can separate them.
Now, and how much of that, the Republican guy got a follow-up question. I'm a registered Democrat, so I should get a follow-up question.
Okay.
How much of this, the communism as a world class fear doesn't exist anymore as of the 80s or so, which is when the prison population starts going up. Is crime in America what has taken the place of international communism, taking us over, overcoming us?
I think my feeling is that the rise in the prison population was more related to domestic social policy. I mean, from the 1970s, the U.S. was put through what's called a structural adjustment program in the third world. And of course, it's different when you do it in a rich country and a poor country. There actually are some rich countries that are doing it to themselves, like Australia and New Zealand, which is very unusual. Mostly these things are forced on countries. But in the United States and England, it was sort of imposed. And those have effects. I mean, they have roughly the effects that they have in the third world, though, it comes out different in a rich country. They have the effect of turning the country into something which has the structural properties of a third world society. You go to any third world country you like, you find some very similar features. There's a small sector of extremely wealthy people, extremely wealthy, privileged people. Their lives are, in Paris and New York, and that's where their money is too, New York and Switzerland, and they have everything you can imagine. They live way better than almost anybody here. Then there's a very large number of people who are struggling to get by, or maybe suffering badly. And you have a large number of people who are just useless. They're in the favelas or somewhere. You just get rid of them somehow. They're targets for say death squads. I mean, in U.S. domains, there's a name for them. They're called in Spanish disposable people. You dispose of them one way or another, maybe by killing them. Well, as the United States moved, and England too, moved toward that kind of a structure, again, let me stress, it's a rich country, so it's not going to look like Brazil or Central Africa. But as you move towards that structural pattern, you get the same phenomenon. More and more disposable people, more and more people getting by or struggling to get by and working harder to do it, and a small sector of extreme wealth. Well, that's what we've been moving for by very definite social policy. It's bipartisan, so you guys can get together. It started clearly in the late Carter period, was picked up by Reagan, is expanded by Clinton. You can choose your party's bipartisan policies. And it's related to other things going on in the economy and so on. And I think that the growth of the incarceration was mostly related to that, but it was picked up very quickly. It was understood that fear of crime is one of the things that can replace the fading communist menace. I mean, it gets pretty hard to claim, officially the United States, like for example in 1985, I don't know if you're aware of this, but in 1985, whoever wrote Ronald Reagan's note cards for him, had him read, because he probably didn't know what was going on, but had him read a statement on May 1st. I picked May 1st, that's important here, to declare a national emergency in the United States because of the threat to the existence and national security of the United States posed by the government of Nicaragua. Okay, so you had the United States about to be overwhelmed by Nicaragua, therefore we have to have a national emergency. Yeah. It's kind of hard to get away with this in public. There was a should be famous incident in American history back in 1962 or so, 61 I guess, when Kennedy was trying to get the countries in the hemisphere to declare an embargo on Cuba and to break relations with Cuba. And the Mexican ambassador is supposed to have said that he wouldn't be able to go along because if Mexico declared that Cuba was a threat to their national security, 40 million Mexicans would die laughing. And that was the population in those days. Well, here, fortunately, people don't die laughing at but we still are calling, Cuba is still called a national security issue. Just last year, when the United States refused to accept World Trade Organization jurisdiction over a European Union case against the U.S. embargo, the U.S. declared a national security exemption. Our existence is threatened if we don't deprive Cuban children of food and medicine. That's the official position. But it's hard to sell that one. Maybe 40 million people won't die laughing, but a lot will think it's really weird. So what you have is other things. Crime is one. International terrorism is another. Just yesterday, there's a big story in the New York Times about the terrorism czar, who's protecting you all from cyber terrorism, which is about to destroy us, from I don't know where, from Afghanistan or somewhere. All of these are, and what does he have, an $11 billion fund or something like that? These are all attempts to frighten people. Islamic terrorist has been for 20 years, one of the main ones. And it's concocted. It's clearly concocted. It's not that nothing lies behind it, But you take anything. It takes the German attitude toward the Nazis and the Jews. Well, yeah, there was something behind it. There were rich Jews. They did have positions of power. There's no propaganda that doesn't have something behind it. There's some little key of truth underneath it somewhere. And it's approximately the same in these cases. And that enables the U.S. to do anything and gets the population supported. So to take a relatively minor case, last August, the U.S., Clinton, bombed and destroyed one of the major pharmaceutical plants in East Africa. If Islamic terrorists had set off bombs in the United States and blown up half of our pharmaceutical supplies, that would have been considered kind of serious. But this was considered nothing, I mean, headline newspapers for a couple of days, and then we go on to the next topic. Because if we want to destroy half the pharmaceutical industry in East Africa, yeah, I mean, we've got to protect ourselves from these Islamic terrorists, even though they had nothing to do with it. And that goes on all the time, and it does control people. Frightens them. That's why the military budget is going up. I mean, who's the military budget defending us against? They're going to have new jet fighter planes. Who are they going to defend us against? I mean, there are more profits for Boeing. And in fact, yeah, Boeing's producing one of the fighters, and that was a plan. Actually, I think it's discussed in this book somewhere. Around the time that this book was come out, the government had just announced, for once publicly, they usually don't make it public, that they were knocking McDonnell Douglas out of the competition for the new jet fighter because they wanted to give it to Boeing, since Boeing needs public subsidies in order to produce commercial aircraft. Okay, that's basically what they said. Virtual. The exact wording is in there.
Not exactly.
I give him a go.
You had it word a little bit different.
No, I'm this from memory, but the exact quote is in there, and that's the content of it. That's the content. The content is we have to transfer technology to the commercial sector, private sector. That's a way of saying the public has to pay for Boeing to produce commercial aircraft by allowing them to produce military aircraft. Okay, that's what in fact, that's why Boeing exists. If you look at the history of Boeing, I think maybe somebody, is that you? Somebody here is from Boeing.
Go ahead, yeah.
Okay, but you look. Okay, it's not you. It's not your fault. You didn't do it. I mean, I did it more than you did. I'm older than you. But back in the Boeing took off. It sort of got started as a government subsidiary back in the 20s and the 30s. It was flying postal for the Postal Service. Yeah. Okay, that's government. That's a government subsidiary, right? There was no market for commercial flights. Yeah. So Boeing sort of took off, good metaphor, on legislation which transferred mail to aircraft and picked Boeing as one of the users. But it wasn't very profitable. In fact, until the Second World War, Boeing barely made a profit. During the Second World War, Boeing made a ton of money by exploiting the fact that there was a war going on and that there were wage controls, and therefore
as much as others, because they're building
plenty. Boeing had huge profits during the Second World War. I've written about it, so I can find the numbers. At the end of the Second World War, after having done its patriotic duty and filled its coffers, Boeing was in a reasonably good position, except that the question was, what's going to happen now? There's no war anymore. Well, then, if you go to the business press, like, say, Fortune magazine actually had a couple of big articles on this in 1947, in which they concluded, this is a virtual quote, but again, I've written the exact ones. They said that the aeronautical industry, meaning like Boeing, cannot survive in a competitive, unsubsidized free market economy. Okay, and therefore there has to be a government input to keep them going. Just so as not to say Boeing, that was generalized to high-tech industry generally. For high-tech industry generally, the government has to be the savior, as Business Week put it. Now, there were good reasons to pick the military as the way to do that. The aircraft industry, I mean, it's not even debatable. The commercial aircraft are sort of modified military aircraft. The jet engines, the body construction, the avionics. I mean, the whole thing is tested and worked out and developed overwhelmingly in the public sector. As the industry, commercial aircraft became, and furthermore, there's plenty of other public subsidy. I mean, who paid for Logan Airport? I mean, there's enormous public subsidies all along the line. There are major efforts to eliminate public transportation for the masses, like electric railways and trains, and turn it over to public transportation for the rich, which means aircraft. One second. By the mid-'80s, Yeah, right.
Forget me.
Pardon?
Forget me. Doesn't want to be forgotten.
Okay, well, let me just make it quick. There was a period in the 80s when Boeing profits were starting to go down. They were making plenty of profit from commercial aircraft at one stage, and even putting their own money into it, big research projects. Also, even that's misleading, because Boeing Aerospace was pulling in plenty of money from federal contracts. By the late 80s, early 90s, it was getting tough, and that's the Clinton administration stepped in with these new programs to, they sort of forced McDonnell Douglas basically out of business, and transferred the jet fighters over to partially to Boeing, partially to Lockheed. That's all that's left. Boeing now has a monopoly, a virtual monopoly on commercial aircraft in the United States. In fact, in the world, there are only two real large-scale commercial aircraft producers. One is Boeing, which is government subsidized all the way, and the other is Airbus, which is equally governmentally subsidized. There isn't a single player in the market of commercial aircraft. And this is not so different in other industries either. Sorry, go ahead.
But just very quickly, because I want to get debate over the facts, we'll just stipulate all of that.
You've been in the courts.
But the thing I would point out, no, because that was a pretty good overview. Very good. I'm impressed. But the thing I will say is, I think that what underscores the point, this has been one of my long-term arguments, you may argue with the mechanism to subsidize some of the things that happen in the industry, but a number of things that you pointed to that indeed were subsidized by the public, indeed have been very good for the public. I submit the internet. I submit, air transportation. These are all things that are very good for us. And so the fact that we, maybe in an imperfect mechanism, but we as a society have chosen to support them.
No, we haven't chosen. We haven't chosen. We haven't chosen. That's the point. It may be good or it may be bad, but we haven't chosen. It has nothing to do with Republicans, Democrats, we're all the same. But I think your point is correct, but I don't think that's the way to look at it. It's not that we have chosen. Virtually nobody knows about it. Virtually nobody knows that the business world in the late 40s concluded that high-tech industry cannot survive in an unsubsidized free enterprise economy, and the government has to be the savior. Nor do people in the. Let me go on with this.
Okay, well, just
certainly people don't know about the internet. Okay, it's not public choice. Now, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing is another question. We could ask, well, what should the public choice have been? So there's two questions. There's a question about modality, how are decisions made, and there's a second question about what the right choices are. Okay, now, with regard to modality, there's two different ways of making the choices. One is by getting the public out of the game altogether and having the choices made among a small sector of wealth, a small corporate sector that runs the state. That's one way. That's the totalitarian way. Okay, that's one modality. The other modality is to do it the democratic way, which we do not do. And then separate from modality comes the question of what are the right choices. Well, here I think there are a lot of questions to ask. So let's go back to the late 40s. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, just a couple of points, because I didn't come to one interest on it.
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
But through that process, a couple of things have happened. When it came time to choose the mail routes and what they're done, that was done through a congressional process. Now, we could have some discussions about
without the public knowing about it. Very few people knew about it. Didn't know what the interests were. They didn't know how the government was subsidizing.
And the other point that I just wanted to make also was through that evolution there that we were discussing with the Boeing company, that was also when the Boeing company came together and they were making the aircraft. They were rolled in with United, they were rolled in with Pratt & Whitney, and they certainly had a monopoly, and the government came in and broke that up. And that split them apart for some time. So it wasn't like these people were necessarily just having their way.
No,
there were indeed some public constraints and controls on them.
There are some public constraints. I completely agree. We have an antitrust system, They don't want too much concentration. And there's competing interests. So like there are competing air engine manufacturer interests that don't want Boeing to kick them out too. So yes, there are competing interests, but let me go back to what I think is the main point. One is the question of modality. How are decisions made? Are they to be made in the totalitarian fashion by a sector of corporate wealth running the state, lying to the public and keeping the public out of it? That's one way to do it, our way. The other way is to do it through a democratic process, discussing it, deciding whether we want to put money into the internet or into aircraft rather than mass transportation and so on. Then comes a separate question. Are the results good? Well, you take, say, Russia, totalitarian system. The results were pretty good. If you look at, say, here it's talked about as a disaster, but that's just crazy. I mean, you compare Russia with other countries that were similar to Russia in 1917, say, Brazil or something like that. You compare them in 1985, they're very different. Russia it was a deeply impoverished peasant society, one of the poorest countries in the world. It became an industrial society with very high rankings on things like health, mortality, education, and so on. It was a disgraceful tyranny, no question about it. But they drove the population to levels of development well above those of U.S. dependencies, like, say, Brazil, which has enormous resources, and where, 80% of the population would have given their lives to be able to live the way an average Russian did. Okay, that's so from the point of view of material benefit, there was plenty. It was a monstrous system, but there was material benefit. And you can give many such examples. Well, now let's get to the heart. Suppose we had a democratic system. Let's imagine that we had democratic decision-making or something remotely like it. Then what would be the right public decisions? Would it be aircraft and the internet, or would it be something else? Well, I think that's a real question. And incidentally, that question was debated. I think maybe that's even mentioned in the book, but it was debated in the business press, the one place where debates were allowed to go on, in the late 40s. So at the same time, when there was a consensus, including the business world, economists, so, Paul Samuelson, etc., that the government would have to step in to prevent the country from going back into a depression, that you'd have to have, major government subsidies to keep high-tech industry going. When that was brought up and became a consensus, there was also a discussion of how the government should get in the business press, like in Business Week. There are discussions about it. And it was understood. There's a lesson that you learn if you took a elementary economics course from Keynes, that the government can stimulate the economy by almost anything. Like it can hide dollars in the sand, and that'll stimulate the economy. It can build schools, that'll stimulate the economy. It can produce jet planes, that'll stimulate the economy. So that was understood. You didn't have to be a sophisticated economist to understand there were a lot of ways of doing it. And there was a debate about whether maintaining the economy, preventing the U.S. from going back to the Depression, should use social spending or military spending. There was such a debate, not among the population. They were out of it. But among the people who count, there was a debate. And it was very quickly decided, without much argument, that the military route was better. And the reasoning was interesting. Think about it. The reasoning was that social spending has a downside. For one thing, it has a democratizing effect. Like if you're going to build a school somewhere, people care about it. They're going to have opinions, and they'll say something. And in general, they'll get kind of active and into the political arena. And that's bad, because we don't want that. On the other hand, if you are building a jet plane, nobody has any opinions. Like, I don't know one jet plane from another, so I don't have any opinion about what jet plane they ought to make. So if things are moved over to the military, if the subsidy for advanced industry goes indirectly through the military system, you don't have this dangerous democratizing effect. The other thing is, second thing is that social spending is redistributed. So it tends to redistribute wealth across the population, whereas military spending is highly concentrated. It's the owners of high-tech industry and investors in high-tech industry and a small category of skilled workers, and not much else. So it's highly concentrated, as distinct from, so it's redistributive upwards, whereas social spending tends to be redistributive downwards. Another advantage of military spending. A third is it's very easy to sell. You just frighten people. You frighten people enough. And all three of these were given as arguments, and I think they're right. And that raises some real questions about what the right decisions would have been all along. Like, for example, are the right decisions to have an internet or to have a system and to have a place where a quarter of the children don't live in poverty. Well, those are decisions, you know. You take a walk around the city, you find plenty of things that ought to be improved for people. Maybe they're more important than an internet, than a jet plane. Well, those are decisions that people ought to make, not have made for them in secret. Sorry.
We should let Kennedy. Come on.
This is not fair.
No, what I was going to say. It goes back to about 2 o'clock. If you made back to New York State, talking about with the murder and that guy with the 3 ounces of cocaine.
Yeah.
Now, you made a remark that a person doing murder was getting less time than the person doing
some possession.
Cocaine.
Yeah.
Now, you know,
If you want the data on that, it's in the exact data.
Certainly a person with 3 ounces of cocaine.
I didn't say 3 ounces. I said possession of cocaine.
Are you sure? You didn't say 3 ounces?
If I did, I don't know how many ounces. Some number of ounces of cocaine.
Let me finish. Some number of ounces of cocaine, whether it's 1 ounce or 2 ounces, is certainly not for one single possession. Depending on, you want to get the details.
Let's say it was 20 ounces. Let's say it was 20 ounces. Let's say it was 20 ounces.
Now, again, someone's going to take that cocaine and sell it to some particular person on the street.
Going to, but to have it is not a crime. Shouldn't be a crime in a civilized country.
Certainly, I mean, again, whether it's an ounce of cocaine his intent is to sell it.
Mm-hmm. Well, how about having a pack of cigarettes?
Having a pack of cigarettes?
That's going to kill people too. In fact, it kills a lot more people than hard drugs do.
10 lines of cocaine and getting behind a car,
No, sorry. If you want to compare it with behind a car, how about a can of beer?
Yeah.
A can of beer is far more lethal behind a car than cocaine is. So, in fact, the fact of the matter is that having a substance should not be considered a crime because so far it's victimless. If you want to talk about distributing substances that are lethal, yeah, that ought to be brought up, but then let's be serious. Tobacco is far ahead of anything else. Alcohol is second. Hard drugs are way down the bottom. And furthermore, most drug use, though it's very harmful for the person, has very little social effect. The crime associated with hard drugs is mostly a consequence of criminalization.
So should we go after the people selling cigarettes, making cigarettes?
If the principle is let's not get lethal substances out to the public, the first one you'd go after is tobacco. The next one you'd go after is alcohol. Way down the list you'd get to cocaine, and sort of invisibly low you'd get to marijuana. In fact, there have been.
Finish. Please, I mean, a lot more violence comes from someone smoking some coke.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't.
Someone smoking a cigarette?
No, that's not true. It comes from purchasing coke and selling coke, but that's because it's illegal. That's because of the criminalization of it. That's because of the criminalization, not the effect. There are good studies of this. The consequences of tobacco doesn't happen to cause, violence, but alcohol definitely does. The deaths that are alcohol related are way beyond the deaths that are hard drug related. If you separate in the hard drug case the deaths that are the result of criminalization. So yeah, when you have drug gangs and narco traffickers fighting for turf and so on, sure, then there's going to be plenty of killings. Just like when you had Al Capone running Chicago. But that's a consequence of the criminalization, not the drugs. What drugs tend to do is make people passive. Alcohol, on the other hand, makes them violent.
The opposite of me.
It might be unusual, but they're very. I mean, there's extensive studies of this. There are extensive studies in the criminology literature, and you can take a look at the results. The basic result is that tobacco-related deaths are way beyond anything else, just an order of magnitude greater. Furthermore, those are not just to the user; they're to everybody else. So deaths from passive smoking alone are much higher than drug-related deaths from passive smoking. Furthermore, they're transferred on to the next generation. Alcohol is the next biggest killer. And it's a killer not only to the people who use it, which is bad enough, but also to others because of its relation to violence. Then comes next is things like hard drugs. And they are rarely harmful to others. they're harmful to the user. When you get down to marijuana, last time I looked, there had been about 60 million users and not one known case of overdose. I mean, it's not good for you, undoubtedly, but it's probably at the level of coffee. And in fact, notice that there has never been a medical reason for criminalizing marijuana. I've looked through the history of this if you're interested. I don't know if you want me to run through it, but it's an interesting history. Marijuana was criminalized. See, very commonly, substances are criminalized because they're associated with what are called the dangerous classes, poor people or working people. So, for example, in England in the 19th century, there was a period when gin was criminalized and whiskey wasn't, because gin is what poor people drank. That's kind of like the sentencing for crack and powder. When in the early stages of Prohibition in the United States, one of the targets was immigrant workers. These guys hanging around the saloons in New York. Got to go after them. The rich guys in upstate New York, they're going to drink no matter what. If they want to come home after work, they'll drink. But go after those guys. What about marijuana? The marijuana was brought in by Mexicans. And the first criminalization of marijuana was in the Southwest, in the States. It was in New Mexico, later Utah, and so on. And it was specifically targeted against Mexicans. It didn't get criminalized in the United States until shortly after Prohibition ended. After Prohibition ended, we had this huge Bureau of Narcotics, and they had to do something. So they discovered, that marijuana is going to do all kind of horrible things to you. The Senate testimony about this is mind-boggling. They did have a representative of the American Medical Association who said, we don't have any medical evidence about this. He was shut up, denounced, they got rid of him right away. Then they found somebody else. This is literally true. They found a pharmacologist, a guy teaching at Temple University, who was doing experiments with marijuana in dogs. Okay. And they brought this guy in to test. The testimony is hilarious. You really have to read it. They brought this guy, and he testified that when he gave marijuana to dogs, they went insane. They did all kind of things. And then some senator or somebody asked him, this is from memory, so it's probably a little off, but something like this. It was in the 30s. They asked the guy, well, have you ever tried marijuana on humans? So he said, yeah, I tried it on himself. And he said, well, what happened? He said, I turned into a vulture. I started flying around the room, So oh my God, this stuff is terrible. It makes people insane. And marijuana, it was declared by Congress that marijuana makes people insane. But then something happened. It turned out that lawyers, defense lawyers, got the idea, okay, I can use this for an insanity defense. So if a guy was found, who killed 3 cops, his lawyer would say, well, he had marijuana before, so he was insane, so he can't do anything. And people were getting off on charges, like cop killing, for example, on the claim that they had marijuana. So all of a sudden it was discovered that marijuana doesn't make you insane. Congress decided, sorry, it doesn't make you insane because we want to wipe that out. The next idea was marijuana is an entry drug. It's the drug you take and then you go on to something else. Well, there was never any evidence for that. But that was decided. And then in the early 50s, something else happened. Marijuana is being brought in here by red Chinese to poison the American population and destroy us, So therefore, we got to stop marijuana. And it kind of goes on like this. Actually, the peak of marijuana use was, as I said, in the 70s. But that was rich kids, so you don't throw them in jail. And then it got seriously criminalized. You really throw people in jail for it when it was poor people. I mean, that's roughly the history. The detailed history is quite interesting.
No, you gotta be careful. You're driving me to drink here. I'm not making a hit.
Can I make one more? Let me just finish this story with one comment. I once heard a speech. There's a legal historian, a guy named, I think, Charles Whitebread or something, who teaches now at UCLA, who's the main historian of marijuana. And I once heard a speech that he was giving to the judges of California. He was talking about the history of marijuana. This is about 10 years ago. He made a prediction. He said he predicted that tobacco was going to be criminalized in the United States. And the reason was it was becoming class-related. And when a drug, historically, when a drug has become class-related, it generally gets criminalized. And in fact, something like that's happening.
Ceremony.